The following feature presentation is part of the Skywalking Network.
This episode of Star Warsologies includes audio from our panel at Star Wars Celebration Anaheim 2022. The panel was called Galactic Critters, Big and Small, and we had a great audience with some great questions at the end. We hope you enjoy it. For video of the wildlife documentaries that are mentioned throughout and the audio you'll hear, you can go to our YouTube channel or check for the links in the show notes.
Thank you. My name is Melissa Miller, and this is the panel we'll be doing, Galactic Critters, Big and Small. It's run by a podcast that I do with my co-host James Floyd called Star Warsologies, where we're both just total Star Wars nerds, but also total like academia nerds. What's your passion? What's your expertise? Come share it with us, because this world of Star Wars is so lived in and so detailed that really every one of our hobbies and jobs and stuff like that is basically represented in Star Wars. So we've had some of our panelists on already episodes, economists. We talked about brewing in one episode, psychology. So there's all sorts of episodes. And for me, I'm very biology-minded, very animals, really big into animals. And so I have always wanted there to be Star Wars wildlife documentaries. So I'm glad this is the right room full of people for me to share that in. And no one was really doing it. There's that YouTube kids series out now that's kind of there, but no one was really doing it. So I was like, well, I'll do it myself and take it to Celebration and see if I'm the only one. So thanks for making it clear I'm not the only one. So I'll have our panelists go down and introduce themselves. And then what we're going to do is I have 4 short wildlife documentaries. I'm going to show them, and we'll do a quick panel Q&A in between each one. And then at the end, we'll do an audience Q&A. So let us know if you have any questions. I got a group of big fans up here who just love speculating about all of this stuff. So you can't ask us anything too nerdy. It's a safe space here. So myself, I'm Melissa Miller. I'm the science and technology writer at Nerdist, and also do freelance articles for Star Wars Insider magazine. I wrote one about the biology of Porgs and about all the different languages in Star Wars. So I just love all of that sort of behind the scenes stuff. Let's go down the line.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sam Wynns, also known as Samantha Wynns. I am a conservation biologist with the National Park Service at Cabrillo National Monument in San Diego, California. And my role entails that I get to do a lot of science. I get to study a lot of the taxa that lives at Cabrillo. So I lead our bird surveys. I also study reptiles and amphibians. I get to do awesome sea creatures in the Rocky Intertidal Zone. But I also spend a majority of my time communicating science and sharing my passion for science with others, kind of like I'm doing today. So I'm really excited to be here. Longtime Star Wars fan. I was born in '77, So it was meant to be. It was meant to be.
Oh yeah, and I forgot, as part of our opening question, the second part of the question was, can you make any Star Wars wildlife noises? So here, I'll be practicing my Porg. So let's see. Sam?
I should have gone first, because now I have to do something that good. I'm a big fan of ye old tauntauns. Hoth is my favorite planet. So I'm gonna try to do a tauntaun sound, but I know James can do one better. I know. He's a tauntaun master.
Safe space.
We're gonna do a tauntaun off after this if you want to stick around. So a little.
Hi, my name is Amit Patel, and I'm a neuroscience and vision researcher at University of California, San Diego. And I work on basically restoring vision, like once you lose it. And I've been a huge Star Wars fan since I was in elementary school. I first started reading like the novels, and then I saw the movies, and then, ever since then, I've been really into Star Wars. And I'm just going to spare you my animal noises.
That's okay.
Hello, my name is Frank Santana. I'm a herpetologist at the San Diego Natural History Museum. So I study herps, not herpes. And herpetology is the study of reptiles and amphibians. And I'm really into Star Wars because my mom in the audience up there, she bought me the VHS when I was When I graduated from junior high school, I was 13 years old, and she bought me the VHS set, and I got into all the cool creatures and interesting things in the background. And my animal noise is, if you imagine a wart, the little wart creature after he eats a nice snack, he makes a burp. So every time you burp, you're doing the wart. So.
Or the sarlacc pit, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Sure, put me after the guy thanking his mom. My name's Jim Lehane. I am a paleontologist. Yay, paleontology. And one of my loves is looking at different science-based movies and kind of determining everything that they did wrong. Because it's almost always wrong, but kind of seeing how to use that information as a teaching tool for other people to actually understand what is right, what did they do right, if anything, and what could they have done to make it right.
Great, thanks. All right, so we'll go ahead and watch one of these documentaries. I sort of did it by biome. I don't know if anyone else has been enjoying the biomes on Disney Plus as much as I have. That was really an inspiration for me, so I sort of broke things up that way. So first up, we have deserts, because we just keep going back to Tatooine. More volume?
Many deserts are home to mostly small animals due to a lack of water and thus plants. While the planet Tatooine has a fair share of rodents, its relatively recent desertification means there are still some large animals there. Some very large animals. The isolated sarlacc is able to gorge itself when presented with the opportunity. It can go years without a meal, consuming nutrients from old meals over long periods of time. The acid of its stomach is much like that of our own. You may well wonder, with a sarlacc's massive scale, could it possibly have natural predators? It does. The crate dragon can dislodge a sarlacc. It uses its pit for its home and makes a meal of the previous inhabitant too. The existence of dragons in the desert has been known for generations, though they are rarely seen alive. They have a multitude of defenses, like spraying acid that nearly instantly dissolves its target. If left alone, they likely live thousands of years, feeding off bantha herds and hibernating between meals. The existence of a pearl in the bowels of the dragon is known, but not its purpose. It is said to be sacred among the native Tuscan populations. Sadly, most of what we know of these giants comes only from incomplete skeletons left to weather in the dunes. Banthas are much more than food to the dragons, though. The Tuscans form strong relationships with them. Banthas roam wild, but also gravitate to the Tuscans for protection and what can only be described as companionship. Black melons are another of Tatooine's mysteries that the Tuscans have solved. These are harvested directly from the sand and provide some sort of milky water, but have only recently been brought to the attention of off-world scientists. Another beast of burden are the dewbacks. Easily tamed and controlled, they were a favorite among stormtrooper patrols and other off-worlders. In the wrecks of Jakku, birds have adapted to harvest nutrients from steel. A small colony of hapabor live near settlements and are often a pest, a very large, very stinky pest. On Malastare, Slither's a beast well known but thought extinct. Even the toughest weapons could not penetrate the hide of the Zillo beast. The Jedi intended to rehome one found during the Clone Wars. While it likely would have unleashed chaos on whatever world they meant to take it, sadly it was first brought to the most inhabited world in the galaxy. After terrorizing Coruscant, it was killed. If there was one, there may be more. On the salt flats of Crete live the Vulpex, the crystal critters. It is a trusting species that, once domesticated, is likely tame for generations. They have a strong sense of survival on this inhospitable world. On Pasana, there lives a great serpent. They are not naturally aggressive, but territorial. Its 3 pairs of eyes serve a different purpose. One sees in our visible spectrum, one in the ultraviolet, and one in the infrared. We, all of us living things in this galaxy, owe each other compassion. The force is all around us, through everything. We must live in balance with it.
I just transferred a bit of life, force energy from me to him. You would have done the same.
Thanks. All right, well, let's jump right into it. Jim, since we keep talking about Tatooine, tell us if it makes sense, and Sam too, does it make sense to have these huge woolly creatures in the desert? I live in Southern California, and the animals out there are generally small, not, these enormous, shaggy beasts like banthas.
When you look at our planet, there are not actually many very large animals that find the desert home. I think camels are probably your largest animal that you can find in a desert that's quote, quote, native to the desert. But even camels, there's evidence that they come from an Arctic region because the term desert actually only applies to the amount of precipitation that it gets. A desert gets 5 inches or less of rain a year. So Antarctica is a desert, does not need to be hot. And so the camel that they think is related to modern day camels coming from the desert, it did have those water pouches because it is also, and it comes from a deserty, low water population. So when we look at the animals in here, we have a lot of very large animals, and a lot of them are actually quite woolly, which is weird. You wouldn't think that, looking at the woolly mammoth sort of thing, woolly mammoth, you wouldn't find a woolly mammoth in the desert, but here we have the bantha, sorry. I know what they're called. Here you have the bantha. Even in The Mandalorian, we had the mudhorn, which was also covered in hair. And it seems like that indicates that the environment of Tatooine had gone through some change. It used to be covered in ice potentially, and these animals kind of survived somehow. But we do have animals in the desert nowadays that are woolly. There's sheep or goats, which are super woolly, and they use that wool to actually protect themselves from the sun and kind of insulate themselves from the heat of the sun. And some goats actually shed all the fur on their underside so the heat can get released on the underside of them, while the overlying fur actually keeps them safe from the desert sun.
Yeah, and there's more to the camel story though, right? Because they're also an invasive creature in some places, Sam?
Yeah. Well, any animal can be an invasive species. The technical definition of invasive species is it establishes and it spreads in an area that is not native to or not endemic. And so actually, camels are a major invasive species in Australia and the outback. They were brought in the 1800s, I think, for kind of camel farming down there, and then when they no longer needed them, or actually, I think it might have been for transportation before the railroads and all of that, and for carrying things, for hauling. When they no longer needed them, they just released them into the desert, and guess what? They're very desert adapted, right? So they're like, sweet, there's no predators here for us. None of the wildlife recognizes us. We can just eat all this vegetation. There's nothing that's killing us, and it's actually a huge problem in Australia. So
it's really hard to get rid of animals that spit at you.
Yeah, that are foul-tempered and spit at you. But I do wonder if modern-day camels will eventually lose their fur over time because evolution, natural selection is always in action. So it's like they've adapted to it, but I wonder if, I'm sure there's some scientists out there that's been researching, how thick a camel's fur is and if that's changing over time to become better desert adapted. Yeah. We'll see.
So Amit, I just added the serpent, which now I forget the name of, and on Pasana has those 3 sets of eyes. And I sort of just added, since I was in charge of writing the script for the documentary, that each set of eyes has a different purpose. But that's not really how it works here on Earth. Is that right, with animals with multiple eyes?
Yeah, usually animals with multiple eyes, each eye is not a separate function, but rather animals that have multiple vision spectrum, their eye can actually adapt and change to detect all kinds of light, not just one. So, like the Vexes, instead of having like an eye for infrared, an eye for normal vision, and for ultraviolet, probably all three can do the same thing, and it just happens to get the input all at once. And you can tell, since it's living underground, most likely it doesn't use its normal vision that much. It's probably adapted to infrared, which, it can detect like animals on the surface that it can capture running around in the tunnels. But there's a lot of like animals, like even in like our world, that do this kind of thing. Like some frogs and fish can actually change their vision to detect infrared and ultraviolet light, like deep underwater or like in areas that are very bright. Frogs actually have this cool thing that, because they're amphibians, they live like partly underwater and like on land. The ones that they can actually adapt, so when they're on the surface of the water, half their eye is below and half is above. So the half that's on top can actually detect normal vision light, but the one that's under the water can actually detect infrared. So they can actually see prey, like predators from below and prey from above. So it's pretty cool.
That is really cool.
Well, so I assume we're going to be asked in the Q&A, so maybe we should just cover it here, whether or not the slow digestion of the sarlacc is something that has any sort of a basis in reality. Is it just hyperbole, that whole, it was off on a speech, right? Oh, over thousands of years, you'll be digested, blah. What in the animal kingdom does stuff like that? Is there any basis? Frank?
So, thinking about the digestive process, it really takes a long time, a lot of energy and resources. So everything else shuts down when you're digesting. So some animals actually have a way to store food that's not being digested in different compartments. So there's actually, believe it or not, have you ever heard of a pocket mouse? Why is it called a pocket mouse? Does anyone know? Where are the pockets? The pockets are in its cheeks, but they're not cheeks. It doesn't stick its food in the cheeks. There's another additional pocket outside of the cheeks. So it's not digesting when it's holding its seeds outside of its cheek in its pockets. So it has a separate compartment, and it can pull that food out later. They can cache it different places. So I think the sarlacc might have a separate compartment where it stores Boba Fett. Boba Fett has his own little compartment. So he's not digesting Boba Fett. He's kind of holding it. Okay, when I'm really hungry, I'm going to pull Boba Fett into my gut, or I'm going to start digesting him. So that thousands of years is more like purgatory, like a waiting period where you're waiting to be digested. So it's just a technicality, but yeah.
I still think every time somebody tried to correct Jabba, Jabba would just knock him into the rancor pit. It's like, actually, it's not a that...
So you're saying we wouldn't make it very far? Well, actually, Jabba.
There's a trap door under our seats. I don't know.
Right now. Oh, that's great. And let's talk a little bit about the Krayt Dragon. It's just bones back in A New Hope. If anyone, I don't want to spoil anything from Kenobi or whatever, but it's part of the story still in the most recent things. Jim, what is that in terms of, how does that match up in terms of dinosaur fossils and things like that people study?
I find the Krayt Dragon amazing that how they've used it here, because the Krayt Dragon in old Legends continuity, they kind of made it look like a dewback. But with The Mandalorian, they went back to the original fossils that you can see on the sands in A New Hope. Fossils that are actually casts of a real dinosaur named Dippy. Actually, the neck vertebrae, the head was completely fake. But they went back to that, and you could see like the Krayt Dragon is super weird because we still don't know what the Krayt Dragon in Star Wars looks like. All we've seen is its neck up. Like, is it like a snake? Is it like just a animal that has 4 limbs and is just have a really long neck? We still don't know what it can actually do.
Oh yeah, I was in a panel with Doug Chang yesterday. I don't know if anyone else was on the Galaxy stage for that. Yeah, and he showed what he thinks it looks like. So that it had legs, and I guess he had presented some, and they got sort of cut back that didn't have legs, but that it had different sets of legs, and they were more mature towards the back, so like the bigger, and then it would grow more and more legs as it got longer and longer.
Do the doggy paddle under the sand?
Exactly. So we've never seen it, but I feel like if Doug Chang thinks it has legs, then it probably has legs. I'm comfortable with that. So, do you have something else to add?
Okay.
I know.
But how practical would legs be under the sand?
It's true.
When you look at animals that burrow like that, I mean, thinking about snakes and caecilians and various other creatures that burrow in earth or sand, they tend not to have legs for that very reason.
Yeah, there's snakes that there's lizards that have body forms like snakes. There's legless lizards, and they, live in these sandy environments, and they lost their limbs, from lizards to snakes.
Yeah. So I think based off of creatures that we have here on Earth, that probably wouldn't be very practical. But of course, this is a galaxy far, far away. So
right.
Who am I to say different there?
Fair enough.
Maybe you have like little mole claws.
Yeah.
Ooh, maybe little mole claws. Okay.
You don't mess with an animal that eats a sarlacc.
That's true. He can have whatever he wants to. Could be different density. Okay. See, this is what it was like. We had a Zoom. Sorry, I know we had to get to our questions, but we had a Zoom session and we just nerded out for like 2 hours, and we're like, oh,
maybe this, maybe that,
go, because we just speculated on all the things,
right?
And scientifically think about the physics behind things, like,
right, yeah. But Doug Chang thinks it looks cool, so it has legs. and so does Terrell Whitlatch, who drew the wildlife of Star Wars book back when the prequel era. So I'll take that. But okay, so on to our next. This one is extreme environments. Open, yes.
Extreme environments like the vacuum of space, molten hot terra, and frigid landscapes might seem inhospitable, but a variety of unique life can be found. A legend only recently filmed for the first time are purgills, often thought of as a danger to ships because of their large size and disinterest in us. It turns out these giants may be force sensitive. People have claimed to feel a connection with them, even a form of communication. They feed on Clauson gas, their colors changing as they satiate themselves. This is due to a symbiotic bacteria that also feeds on the gas. They bioluminesce when preparing to travel at hyperspeed. That's right, purgill are the only known species to naturally travel at hyperspeed. Also, in the depths of space lives the Summa verminoth. Or shall I say, lived. Unfortunately, the one and only record of this giant includes its death. Among its arms and suckers were electric impulses and spines. Certainly a threat to many, it was no match for the maw at the heart of the Kessel Run. Some species feed on the power sources of our ships. Minocs are silicon-based life forms that can live in the vacuum of space, feeding on electricity, a constant pest to pilots. Though there are bigger problems. Once thought to be legend, pilots traded stories about giant slugs living in asteroid fields. Exogoths are still not well studied. Little is known of their communal nature and eating habits. Even planets whose lava cores are still flowing have life. Lava fleas have been domesticated on Mustafar. The cold worlds also harbor more life than one may think. Tauntauns run rampant, feeding on lichen that grows in caves. Also dwelling in caves, though, are their biggest threat. The wampa stores extra food hanging from the ceiling, planning for lean times. Surprisingly, tauntauns can also die of exposure. In the ice caves of Maldo Crace live the ice spiders. A chemical signal emits from the egg casing to essentially sound the alarm that it is time to hatch or risk being eaten. The queen is protected by her hive, generations of her offspring that live communally. Their webs can be shot, an alarming feature, as are their massive rotating jaws. For all these adaptations, it is not known what they feed on. Oh, and they can jump. While they can be crushed or burned, they are hardy creatures. Many species in extreme environments seem to be territorial creatures, likely due to food scarcity. It is a risky place to travel.
As one of the people who helped put all the clips together, if I never see those spider clips ever again, I will be a happy person.
Yeah, I'm arachnophobic myself, but watching those over and over, and now I do have love for the ice spiders because they were just chilling, just hanging out.
Spiders are people too, Jim. Spiders are people too.
They've already made action figures of them, so they must be popular.
Right, there you go. Well, let's start off with the spiders since we're there. Frank, is there real life examples of that sort of timed egg hatching?
Yeah, so in the clip we showed, Grogu can't help himself but eating anything that's smaller than him, essentially. So he ate, popped open one of those egg cases and grabbed a spider, and all of a sudden the other ones started hatching out. And so we think that there's a chemical kind of signal, like a stress response that spider emitted. And in the amphibian world, this happens a lot. It's pretty interesting if you guys have ever seen tadpoles developing in a pond. What happens when it starts getting really hot and the tadpoles need to get bigger and bigger? The pool starts drying up and they start putting out this stress response. And so as the pool gets smaller and smaller, some of the tadpoles start to change. Their teeth and their mouth parts and their digestive tract starts to change. They become carnivorous, actually. So the signal is that we're running out of water, running out of space. Let's start eating each other so some of us will get big enough so that we can metamorphose before this pond dries up. If we don't adapt and do that in a short time period, none of us will survive. And they can actually tell which ones are their siblings and which ones aren't in a lot of species. So it's like this amazing developmental pathway that can be, through chemical communication, can change and adjust. So a lot of good inspiration from Star Wars in real life.
Tadpole Thunderdome.
So what are some other real-life adaptations to extreme environments? Amit, I know you had talked about some animals that can reanimate. Is that right?
Yeah. So there are actually animals that can totally freeze themselves and then come back to life. But basically, so some of the stuff where people are studying in cryogenics is based on real animals. There's some frogs that can totally freeze themselves during the winter. Basically, they're pretty much dead. And then when it warms up, they'll just come back to life. There's also a few types of squirrel that can do this. Basically, during the winter, they'll burrow down and completely freeze and then thaw themselves out. And then they're totally fine. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and unfortunately, our cell biologist, Michelle, couldn't make it at the last minute. So we don't have her expertise about all the bacteria that can do these sorts of things too. And really, that's what lives at a lot of these extreme environments like hydrothermal vents and Antarctica. And there are actually bacteria on Earth that feed off of electricity. And so that's sort of where I got the idea for the purgill too, is I've still haven't seen Rebels. I'm going to go home tomorrow and start watching it. But someone brought the purgills to my attention, and now they're my favorite. But really seeing them change color and then utilize, that gas to then be able to travel through hyperspeed is really, really cool to me, and probably has something to do with the bacterial relationship. But Sam, what would an animal have to do to be adapted to such a big deal, like hyperspeed?
Well, we do have animals on Earth that go very fast. Some of you may have heard of the peregrine falcon. Raise your hand if you have heard this animal. Who thinks the fastest animal on Earth is the cheetah? Nobody, a couple people. Okay, you're wrong. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. They are the fastest animal that runs, that self-propels, right? But the peregrine falcon is the fastest animal that has been clocked in a dive. They can go over 240 miles per hour, and we actually think they can go faster than that. And they do have to have all kinds of adaptations to be able to withstand that speed. You can imagine the force as they're diving through the air, just air coming up through their nostrils alone, so they can completely close off their nostrils with that nictitating membrane, right, and close their eye over to protect their eyes. These incredible fusiform shape, that shape that looks like a torpedo. It's shaped that way, or a bullet is shaped that way, so it's much more aerodynamic or hydrodynamic, right, depending on which medium they're in. You do see this in the wild a lot, these incredible adaptations. Also, animals that will be completely desiccated, completely dried out, like rotifers. If you've ever heard of fairy shrimp, their pools completely dry out and they're just dormant for years and years and years on end until there's a rain, and then boop, they're back to life and they're procreating and they're doing all the things that the animals do. So Pretty incredible stuff.
Yeah, very cool.
It's realistic.
All right, I think we're ready to move on to swamps.
In contrast to extreme environments, forests and swamps have an incredible amount of biomass. Life teems. Everywhere you look, everywhere you touch, is home to life. On some inhabited planets, we know much about the local wildlife, while on others, there are still many mysteries that remain. The locals have lived amongst them for thousands of years. On Dagobah, snakes and lizards abound. Perhaps that is why Master Yoda chose it for his home. His species has an insatiable appetite, after all. Can they tell what is poisonous? Naboo's forests are home to an amazing array of herbivores. Endor is only recently being explored. It holds many wonders. There are some animals taken from their natural habitat. Little is known about the rathtar, but it is a popular species in exotic zoos. Dianoga is a species that has taken well to the industrial times and can thrive nearly anywhere there is standing water. They grow to the size of their surroundings. They can be found in as little as a small puddle of water, but become formidable quickly.
I really like that Dianoga one now because over in the droid builder thing right across the hall, someone has a mouse droid with a Dianoga sticking out of it. So I was like, oh, they left a little bit of water there and a Dianoga just moved in.
It's how it works.
Yeah. So Frank, there's obvious tie-ins there for reptiles and amphibians on Dagobah. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what would make a planet have such a huge biomass?
So thinking about Dagobah, I remember when I first saw The Empire Strikes Back, I kind of thought of Dagobah as being kind of cold and swampy, right? But maybe that's because I'd never been to Florida and I grew up in Southern California. But thinking about it with all that biomass, it has to have a lot of energy, right? A lot of energy input. So Dagobah probably feels more like Orlando. If you've ever been to Celebration Orlando, it's a lot more hot and humid. So there's a lot of energy there. So all that solar energy, all that heat energy on the planet of Dagobah supports a lot of biodiversity. So if you think about where we are here in Southern California, if you go down to Ecuador on the equator, right? Ecuador is, it gets a lot of solar energy. There's a lot more biodiversity. So thinking about the species, the number of species in an area, if you get more solar energy and you have these ideal conditions, that supports more. So I think Yoda probably moved in Dagobah because there's a lot of stuff to eat for him too, right? He would never get bored of all the options of food that he could have on Dagobah. So all that energy, warm, humid, creates a lot of biodiversity.
Yeah, I like that little retcon that we've made here. So Jim, that has some tie-ins to prehistoric times as well. The warmer environment, oxygen content, all that stuff.
Oh, yes. Where are we going with this? So if we look back the history of our planet, at different times on our planet, we've had different varying amounts of oxygen. Right now, we're all used to the size of the bugs and the size of the animals that we know today. But if you go back about 400, 500 million years ago, there was a lot more oxygen on Earth. And looking at insects and things, the size of the insects are directly tied to the amount of oxygen in the atmosphere. When you have more oxygen in the atmosphere, your insects can get bigger because they absorb the oxygen straight through their bodies. They don't have lungs that like other animals do. And so you can look at the size of the animals to determine what kind of environment they lived in. And so larger insects means more larger insects means more oxygen in the environment. You could also look at swamp environments, and swamp environments are going to have, like you said, a lot more diversity, a lot more life, because you have more energy. You can have animals finding their own little niches, their own little places that they can kind of maximize their potential. And so you have, the more energy you have, the more spaces and the more animals you can have. Just look at the Amazon rainforest today. Huge diversity down there, and that's something similar that we'd see on Dagobah or anywhere we have a lot of different types of plants and warm environments.
So Amit, how would the one eye of the Dianoga connect differently in terms of and we don't have any of those on Earth here, but
Yeah, so the one eye is actually a huge problem. I think what they were going for is like they're trying to make it like a periscope, but the problem is a periscope is just like a kind of like a magnifying glass or a telescope. There's another person at the end who's like using both eyes to see into it. So when you only have one eye, you lose your depth perception. You can't judge how far away things are relative to each other. And so, animals that are born with one eye, just for like genetic defects, they generally like don't have the best vision. They can see movement, so they basically rely on their vision for like seeing quick movements and just saying like, oh, there's something out there. But they usually use their other senses to determine like how far away is like sound, like by footsteps or something, or by like feeling like air and wind, smelling. But having one eye is not so useful, especially if you're using it to like find where things are. It probably uses like water movement to like determine distance or something, but the eye is probably not for vision that much.
Could it be an adaptation for like a cave type environment where a lot of animals in caves now don't have any eyes, don't have any vision, where if you had one eye, the one-eyed monster would be king over the
it probably gets
no
like early warning of like, oh, something's out there, because like light moves faster than sound, right? So probably sees like, oh, there's something there, let me like get ready to like find it.
Well, speaking of the dianoga, Sam, I know that you study in terms of industrial environments and animals that sort of, we encroach on them, but then there are some that are better adapted to be able to hang out in urban environments.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we see this in our cities, right? Everyone has that trash panda that comes through their backyard and rifles through their trash. So there are animals that are extremely well adapted to living with humans. And are actually, because natural selection is always at work, adapting over time. So their physiology is changing, what they eat is changing. So yeah, I mean, it's completely possible that it has become adapted to living with people and will do well. Look at cockroaches, right? Rodents, right? With people everywhere all over the world. So.
Yeah, I think in Terrell Whitlatch's book, it even has like a little side thing of them like taking over the sewers on Coruscant or something like that, and becoming a problem there.
Isn't that how dogs really got domesticated too? Is they were following nomadic tribes of people eating their refuse, and eventually the people just kind of took them in.
Well, the friendlier wolves that were like, they would get the more scraps, right? If they were more brave and friendly towards the humans, and then eventually that's wolves became dogs. Yes, your pug is actually descended from a wolf. And what's interesting, like genetically, if you look at them, they have the exact same genes. It's just whatever gene is being transcribed and which proteins are being made. So, I don't know. There's some weird genetic manipulation. We could go in there to maybe turn pugs back into wolves. Anyone want to volunteer?
I don't think we do.
Yeah.
Chihuahua wolf.
Yeah. Exactly.
Oh my gosh. I feel
See
like
what
now.
I mean? I know. Sorry, we go off on these tangents.
Now it's only a matter of time. We don't need to give anyone ideas if they haven't already had it.
True.
All right. So for our last documentary, I'm a big ocean person, so we've got our oceans.
There are still many uncharted oceans on uncharted planets. Seemingly isolated in the middle of an ocean, an island's ecosystem is diverse. From the breathtaking cliffs to the surrounding shallows and the foreboding ocean depths, an island's world teems with life. Thaler sirens seem to enjoy intertidal zones present on some islands. In this habitat, they drink seawater, but separate and expel the salt, and even tolerate the presence of humans. Porgs are a curious beast. They nest in the open and don't have much fear of predation. They imprint during the nesting season and often mate for life. This has been known to occur with other species. Though beware welcoming porgs into your life, as they can be destructive. On ocean worlds, some species have adapted to live both above and below the water. The Aiwa is one such majestic beast. Many even accept riders and can become quite attached to Kaminoans. There are many, though, that simply wait in the depths. And as a wise Jedi once said, there's always a bigger fish. In the abyss that forms the core of Naboo, many predators lie in wait. Their massive size requires a slow metabolism, but they can move quickly when prey wanders by. The Kolo clawfish and OP sea killer are both massive themselves, but dwarfed by the apex predator, the absolutely colossal Sando aqua monster. On Mon Cala, the ocean planet includes both sentient creatures and wildlife. Inhabited for millions of years, they generally live in harmony, though there are still many wild places and threats to those who don't know the planet well. When war came, some species were weaponized. Perfectly peaceful eels can cause pain when abused. A species of modified jelly was abandoned on Mon Cala, now breeding and overtaking native species. The Rokna on Castellon are rarely seen gentle giants. Their tentacles have sensory organs used for smelling as well as touch and taste. When we encroach into the ocean and try to tame its creatures, we challenge the balance with aquatic life and are often destined for failure. There is much we don't understand, and some that seem like a threat are actually much more in danger from our actions. We must try to live in harmony. We can learn much from these creatures. When we involve the natural world in our wars, nature always seems to lose. From the petite porgs on island shores to the supersized Sando aqua monster in the watery depths, galactic ocean ecosystems are home to creatures, great and small.
Thanks. All right, well, let's jump right into it. Amit, tell us a little bit about that scene with Grogu. I feel like when I was writing an article for Star Wars Insider, which is how we met, about vision, that scene where it shows what the sea star is looking at when it sees Grogu is the only time we really see through the eyes of a critter. Is that how it would look to something with compound eyes?
Again, no. So when you have multiple eyes, it's generally more that each eye forms like a piece of your vision, and they all come together to form one single image. Basically, your eyes are just detectors for light, and it's your brain that actually puts everything together. And so, like insects with compound eyes, each of those little hexagonal things that you see, they're not individual visions. It's just like each one is maybe like a pixel, like each one forms a pixel of your picture, and like in the end, just like one single picture.
It looked cool, though.
It does look pretty cool.
I did pause it, I think, in first viewing and be like, I'll bet that's not how that works. All right, well, let's talk about island life from the beginning of the video with Acto. How is it different on something isolated like that versus on larger land masses? Frank?
So nice thing about islands, here on planet Earth is that, it's hard for big animals to get there, so the small animals can fly there and, be protected. So what did you all notice about the Porgs' nests on the islands? What would they look like? They were really exposed, right? Normally, if you have like birds here, they're up in trees, they're trying to avoid predators, but there's no big predators for Porgs, so they can build their nests out in the open. They're really not really afraid of, if you visit an island and there hasn't been humans there, they're not the birds, for example, on the Galapagos, you can walk right up and pick them up. And they're just not used to predators. So it's an opportunity to, right, they're just not afraid. You shouldn't touch them, but, so they can, nest out in the open. It's a really different environment. So they're really adapted to these protected islands where they can nest and have babies. But they also have this critical period where they learn from their parents. So the Porgs seem to bond and imprint on the people around them. So it seems like they took a liking to Chewie when they were in that critical learning period, and they kind of thought that he was one of them, maybe. So it's interesting behavior there.
So islands are also very interesting because they're so isolated that any animals have a tendency to evolve to be smaller on islands because you're dealing with less food source and less predation. So you don't, a lot of this, when you have large animals, they're usually large for a defense mechanism. You don't eat the large animal because it's too much work and it can hurt you. But there are instances of mammoths on our planet that have evolved on islands to become dwarf mammoths. And there's some of the latest known mammoths that we know are these dwarf mammoths.
Can I add to that
Please.
a little bit? I just, for the conservation perspective, right, islands have really special, everywhere has special life, right? But, you know, they've evolved in this little pocket away from anywhere else on planet Earth. So, like lemurs, right, only come from Madagascar, an island. And from the conservation perspective, they're also very vulnerable to problems like invasive species because, you know, these animals have basically, I don't want to say, it's a living system, so it's not a vacuum, but in this isolated unit, they have evolved. And if something else comes in, it decimates them, right? So you have, for instance, like New Zealand. So if you look at this, real examples all over planet Earth, New Zealand has like the only flightless parrot, for instance. It's called a kakapo. It's really adorable. And it's highly endangered because it de-evolved basically how to fly, didn't need to fly anymore. It had all the resources it needed on its island, right? But now the rats and domestic cats have come to the island. They just decimate. There's this just trundling fat parrot that's ground dwelling, right? So yeah, they're ripe for conservation problems, the islands that we see here in the Star Wars universe.
And then it takes a lot of work to get rid of those invasive species. So hopefully on the Millennium Falcon there weren't any pests that were coming out and taking over that island in the future. So.
Yeah, well, this is something we talked about in Star Warsologies. It's like, is there conservation in the Star Wars universe? Because you just see people flying willy-nilly and doing all kinds of things. These planets like bringing porgs with them on the Millennium Falcon elsewhere. And so I'm just wondering if there are any sort of rules and regulations.
There's Star Wars customs.
Yeah, is there Star Wars customs? Like, New Zealand does it right. I mean, they take it, because they started to have all these problems, they actually take conservation very seriously. They have a They have a Department of Conservation in their government, and like they spray every aircraft that lands. They make you check your bags. They make you scrub your feet so there's no like seeds or anything on them. I mean, they're serious about it because it's been such a problem there.
So maybe the Millennium Falcon goes through a biosecurity protocol, but it's always shown off screen. So if anyone wants to see the deleted scenes of the biosecurity, it's probably there somewhere.
Although if you've been to Batuu, right at Galaxy's Edge, there are some porg nests up in that base. So clearly they got loose on Batuu after following Chewie. So. Well, I know Jim wants to talk about the watery core of Naboo over there. Tell us a little bit about, why that's not a real thing.
If anybody remembers the Phantom Menace, they say that they need to go through the watery core. And every time I hear that, I cringe. Because it's probably just a really big body of water that they're calling the core, because no. There's no planet out there that has the core of water. It's literally impossible.
Much less filled with such enormous creatures. I know Jim was talking about the smaller life in like intertidal zones and stuff like that, but what about in the deep oceans?
In the deep ocean, you have the space. And really, like, if you look at animals on land really have size constraints because of gravity. You lose a lot of those size constraints when you go into the water because the water adds buoyancy. So you do not need to be as little if you want to grow up big. It is possible. Whales, the largest animal on the planet ever, I believe, much bigger than the dinosaurs ever got, the blue whale, because it has those buoyancies. So it grows up big. And like I said before, size is a factor when you're being predated upon. The bigger you are, the less likely you are to be eaten.
Yeah. Do we have a minute to add to that?
Yeah.
Too? Yeah, and you'll see this too with mammals, because we heat our bodies. We're endotherms, right? We heat our bodies from the inside. Deep water is cold. And so you not only have protection like blubber and but it's actually the volume to surface area ratio. The bigger the animal, the colder it can get. So you notice this even on land, right? I mean, polar bear is the largest bear on Earth. It's in the Arctic, right? So same thing, you're going to end up with some really big, if you're going to have mammals in that deep, cold ocean, they're going to be big mammals. You can even look at seals and sea lions, and the bigger ones are usually the ones that live in the Arctic or Antarctic regions in the colder waters.
And that relates directly to our space animals. All the ones we see, except for the Minox, are big.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very true.
So our final slide here is definitely not maybe an optimistic view of things. I always felt like David Attenborough's specials always include a little conservation message, how humans are affecting our galaxy. So Sam, why don't you tell us a little bit about your conservation message about us here with our oceans?
Well, man, I know.
We've got
this is hard.
2 minutes.
This is hard. So my science can be a bit of a downer. I'm sure you're probably aware. We are actually in our 6th mass extinction event right now. The dinosaurs is one of them, right? That's the most famous. And that's pretty much entirely due to human activity. So the top 5 drivers of extinction are habitat loss from humans, climate change from humans, pollution from humans, invasive species, usually brought by humans, and disease, which we are vectors for disease, carrying things like chytrid fungus and white nose, the fungus that causes white nose syndrome and things like that. But yes, we are part of the problem, but we can also be the solution. And actually there are actions you can take every day that do make a big difference over time. And then there are big actions you can take in your life too. You don't have to become a conservation biologist, though I highly recommend it, or a climate change researcher. But even just using your voice, right? Using the power of your voice for voting for things that are important to you. That's my conservation message to you. But if you like the galactic creatures, let's care for the creatures that live here on Earth too. Healthy ecosystems mean healthy people. We get our clean air, clean water, our food source, our nutrients from healthy ecosystems, right?
Yes, and I think there's room for a Star Wars conservation movie, or show, right? Because there are a lot of cool conservation messages within Star Wars. They're kind of more subtle and hidden. Thinking about Tatooine used to be a very verdant green place, and then the Tusken Raiders had to be adapted to survive in this desert because it changed. So there's some messages there, and I think the prequels were political, talking about political issues, and I think conservation and climate change and all those issues are political issues. So there's room for stories that kind of have that positive, hopeful message, because Star Wars is ultimately about hope. So hopefully we can pitch that to Kathleen Kennedy to do a Star Wars conservation movie.
Maybe the next one will be about restoring the galaxy.
You're right, yeah. There you go. Well, we want to open it up for audience Q&A, so if you have any questions, Jim, you'll have to share a mic for this part so that that goes back down there. But I do want to say real quickly, this panel, I'm recording it. We're going to have it up on our Star Warsologies podcast that I run with James Floyd. Also, yesterday's panel, I don't know if anyone was here for Science of the Attack of the Clones yesterday. That'll also be an episode there. And I'm going to put these documentaries up on YouTube via our Star Warsologies page. Until I get a cease and desist letter from Lucasfilm. So check that out, and please do share them if you enjoyed them. But we'll get to audience Q&A if there is any. Yeah, go ahead. Or there is a microphone up there, but I know everyone's a little bit boxed in, so you could just project whatever.
I was wondering what the general thoughts are as far as the varactyls, specifically the giant bird lizard that Obi-Wan was riding in Episode 2. Because between that and the Rancor, I've noticed distinctively missing, and I would have assumed those being in mountain terrains from what we could see. Was there any thought given on those regions or those particular creatures?
Oh yeah, no, I definitely had to cut a lot of things. For me, it was a lot of the captive species, like the Rancor that I ended up cutting, or the ones on Geonosis. But yeah, I totally forgot about the lizard that Obi-Wan rides around. I'm going to throw that one to our herpetologist.
Yeah, so the question was about the varactyls, the lizards with feathers that Obi-Wan rides in Episode 3 on Utapau. And They remind me of iguanas, like large land iguanas, but they're kind of like a mix. We're always inspired through real world animals. So a mix between a big land iguana and a gecko, because they can climb up walls and things like that. And then feathers, right? So dinosaurs actually had feathers, so it obviously has some kind of lineage or relation to feathers, possibly for communication to kind of like signal, like a peacock has colorful feathers, so maybe that was a male varactyl, and he would use his feathers to communicate with females. Those are awesome creatures, so thanks for bringing that up.
But not thermoregulation too, also heating or cooling the body, but not flying.
And Rancor was always one of my favorites as a kid. To me, it's a big moment, the Rancor keeper coming in crying at the end there. That's really that was the story for me. I wanted to follow that guy. And sort of same in Book of Boba Fett, like don't introduce Danny Trejo and then not give me a montage of training the baby Rancor, but maybe that'll come out as an additional one.
Let's go in the green shirt, because he's had his hands up a while.
All right.
Why don't you come up to the mic?
Yeah, that'll help. Thanks.
Isn't Hoth a desert because it doesn't have that much rain and it's very cold, but it's like cold desert?
Mm-hmm. Yep, Jim told me we were gonna get that. He's like, technically Hoth should be in the deserts.
It's an Arctic desert.
And you're absolutely right, but I'll let you explain that one.
I didn't understand the full question.
That Hoth should be in the desert sequence, not separate, which you told me.
I agree. Nobody listens to me.
If they would stop going back to Tatooine, I wouldn't have had such a long desert video. So, new planets, please. In the blue shirt there.
My question is about the Baltics or Baltic seeds, whatever plural is, on Crete, because that seemed like one of the only animals that was primarily, it was an animal, but it also had a mineral component. What are your thoughts on that and any sort of realism there, or is that just kind of like a hard no, that's just fantasy?
Oh, this is a great question, because this is one we got at Comic-Con and we didn't have a really good answer for, so we just sort of I don't know. And then our person here, Michelle, who was supposed to be here, has a great answer for it, but she's not here. So I just sort of skipped that question. But yeah, the crystal critters, what is that? Is that salt that makes that noise? What's going on? Who's got an idea?
I've had lots of thoughts about that thing.
All right. You can share two.
Huh?
Like I said, you can share two.
Okay, sure. So, looking at the crystals themselves, I'm pretty convinced that it can't be salt that is on those animals, because salt doesn't behave that way. It doesn't clink when you have the salt crystals. Salt crystals generally aren't small and angular, but the problem is the biological component of it, because biology has the ability to change a lot of the minerals if you're absorbed into your body. Your bones are made out of apatite, which is a mineral. Clamshells are made out of minerals. So you have the animal that is able to basically remodel the minerals in our system, in our world, to suit their own purposes. So it is possible that those are minerals that it's taken up into itself and the body has readjusted them. I'm pretty sure it's not going to be any variety of salt, though. So my guess would be kind of a quartz type of system, like a silicone coating that it has.
There are also, basically there's proteins that we make that take on a crystal-like structure, like our lenses in our eyes. They're proteins, but they arrange in a certain way so they become clear, and crystal-like. It's possible these have some special kind of, they're secreting some kind of protein that crystallizes and makes that noise.
Super cool. Yeah, in the TikTok.
I guess I have two questions. One is with honeybees and you get colony collapse and all of that. In terms of conservation, I understand honeybees are actually an invasive species.
Yes.
So how do we, there seems to be a huge conservation to try and keep said invasive species, so how does that weigh against the need to get rid of invasive species? And also, do you think that there is a group of, I think they're called extremophiles, somewhere else in the galaxy that are looking at us and going, how could they possibly live in such conditions?
Sure. Oh, great questions. Do you want to take the honeybee one?
For sure. I'm really happy you brought that up, because there's so much like save the bees, and I'm always like, yeah, save the bees, save the native bees. So San Diego, for instance, has over 700 species of native bees, and they're actually discovering new ones every day. It's a biodiversity hotspot for bees. And a lot of those bees pollinate very specific plants that also co-evolved along with them there. So if those, for instance, ultra-green sweat bee go away, become extinct, therefore maybe their plant will as well. So we're really worried about those sorts of things. And the honeybees they're really effective. They're incredible. They're actually European honeybees or Western honeybees. We brought them over from Europe for our crops. And because they're so well adapted, they're out competing a lot of the native bees. And so there's a big conservation concern. So if y'all are worried about native species, like all the cute bumblebees you see buzzing around, plant native plants that are native to your region. There are native nurseries located everywhere. You just need to do a little digging, a little Google searching for that. But we have created a conservation problem for ourselves because our crops rely on honeybees for pollination. So it's in the world of conservation, it's kind of a two-edged sword, right? It's like, yeah, we can't get rid of our honeybees. We need them to pollinate our crops, like almonds and blueberries and things. But simultaneously, those honeybees, you can't contain them to crops only. So it's a tough one, right? It's a really tough one.
And what was the second part of that question?
Second part. Extremophiles.
Oh, the extremophiles.
Extremophiles, talking about how a species could possibly live in such.
Right. I love the idea of someone looking down at Earth and being like, how do they do it? So.
And we do have extremophiles that live here on Earth that actually can withstand the vacuum of space. I'm sure you've all heard of tardigrades before, right? I mean, which is pretty amazing. So it's plausible.
Yeah, so we can take one last question, and then we will also hang around afterwards out, or it sounded like we could stay in here or out there. To answer more questions. And also James at the back, the guy with the microphone there, will have some buttons to hand out on your way out the door. So let's see, I feel like I saw your hand with the back. Yeah. Yep, you. Thanks, James.
You guys talked a little bit about invasive species a bit earlier, but how we see like all these species in the Star Wars universe, how much of the species that you see do you think are actually native to the environment that we find them in? Because we see the Rancor is brought over, and I don't believe that it's native to Tatooine. We see Lando Calrissian smuggling a puffer pig onto the Thal. We see like all this transportation, like across a far greater distance, like intergalactic, like on a far greater scale than we have on Earth. So how do you think that impacted the galaxy's wildlife on a larger scale?
Yeah, it's true. We'd have to go way back in time to figure out what animals came from where, and the Minox grabbing onto ships and following them, wherever they land. That's definitely a huge thing. Does anyone else have any thoughts on it?
Well, the technical term is it's influenced the galaxy a lot. That's the scientific term. I'm just kidding. But there's probably someone who is a huge Star Wars wildlife geek out there who's actually mapped where every single species has come from and if it's been, introduced. There are instances here on planet Earth of, even though the technical term for invasive species is establishing and spreading, there tends to be a negative connotation to that, right? So establishing, spreading, and therefore outcompeting or damaging the ecosystem in some way. But there are, like peregrine falcons, for instance, we have them here in North America. They weren't from North America originally, but they've naturalized here. And they've become native species over time and have become part of the ecosystem over time. So this all goes to say that not all invasive species will completely decimate every single ecosystem they go into. Sometimes they can actually just kind of merge into that ecosystem and become part of it. So let's end with a hopeful note that a lot of these species are actually just kind of adapting and merging into the ecosystem rather than completely destroying the entire planet.
Yeah, that's a nice thought. So, well, thanks everyone so much for
coming. Thank you very much. We'll leave it up. All right, the critter people.
I want to to thank everyone who came to the panel at Celebration, and especially those who stayed afterwards to keep asking questions. I know myself and all of our expert panelists had such a great time and loved sharing these geeky moments with all of you. Thanks for listening to this episode. We'll have one more from Celebration and then back to our regularly scheduled program of expert interviews. Thanks so much for listening.